Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's SANS webcast, an evaluator's guide to next generation SIEM, sponsored by LogRhythm. My name is Carol Ott of the SANS Institute. Today's featured speakers are Chris Crowley, Senior SANS Instructor, who will be moderating today's webcast, Barbara Filkins, Senior SANS Analyst, and Sarah Kingsley, Product Marketing Senior Manager at LogRhythm. If during the webcast you have any questions for our presenters, please enter them into the questions window located on the GoToWebinar interface at any time. Please note that this webcast is being recorded, and a copy of the slides and recording of this webcast will be available for viewing later today and can be found on the SANS registration page. And with that, I'd like to hand the webcast over to Chris.
Thank you very much, Carol. I appreciate it. I wanted to just mention a couple of things before we get started. First of all, when SANS first approached me about this, I was really excited because this is a critical decision that most organizations need to make in terms of their security operations center. This SIEM is the underpinning for a lot of the things that that people do. And most of the time, this decision is made in the absence of the right sort of information. And when SANS said that they wanted to write a guide, a methodology guide in terms of how people should consider this critically important decision, I was really excited to hear that they were doing that. So I'm going to turn things over to Barbara, and she's going to explain some of the findings that came out of this paper and some suggestions for you in terms of how exactly to approach this critically important decision.
Thank you, Chris. And I just wanted to really quickly review kind of why we're here. As Chris said, this technology, but it's actually a integration of technologies, in my opinion, is critical. And he mentioned Security Operations Center, but even beyond that, it has the promise of being able to create in one place for an organization actionable information from all the data gathered that can be gathered across the elements and devices in their enterprise. The challenge is that it needs to remain relevant in the face of change. New threats happen, and there's always changes to organizational infrastructure, both from a technical standpoint as well as from changes in how people are approaching support strategies, especially in an environment that is moving towards cloud computing and mobile. And then we have a legacy problem. SIEM is notorious for being difficult to configure and maintain. It can be hard to justify the cost because a lot of times it suffers from what I consider a hidden cost syndrome. The planning didn't go in to know that there's a cost involved in keeping things relevant and up to date. So with that, let's take a really quick look at the SIEM building blocks. It started largely with log management systems, and back in the early 2000s, the analyst program actually ran a bunch of surveys around log management. And we gradually transitioned, probably somewhere around 2002, to looking at a more comprehensive case where security information management, which automated the collection of event data, and security event management, which actually now started to put in the aggregation, correlation, and notification for events. Very often it was called a FAT event or a FAT conglomeration because things are pulled together from various sources. That has merged into what we could consider a legacy SIEM, which integrates those foundational elements into a centralized solution, but a centralized solution was often constrained by limitations in the infrastructure on which it was being built. And so now we're looking at the next generation SIEM, which with the use of cloud, machine learning, analytics, that you can focus on capabilities, not just the infrastructure. It becomes more of what you can get out of the event information that you're gathering and understanding, and then being able to act upon it. So one of the things that I think was a starting point was to come up with what are the core tenets of what next generation SIEM actually is, as opposed to, let's say, legacy. There's definitely overlap, but hopefully NextGen can close some of the gaps and reduce some of the problems that the legacy implementations have faced. So we looked at needs. You need to look at a modern hybrid infrastructure that crosses on-prem, cloud, and mobile as a single entity. You need to be able to visualize things in real time. You need to be able to detect, classify, and escalate and respond to threats, also in real time. That's where things like scenario and behavior-based analytics come in, and being able to grab threat intelligence from various sources. Being able to search efficiently against the large data volumes from the variety of sources. And that's where things like big data architecture, and people can think of big data as a buzzword, but in actuality, if you look under the hood, things like Hadoop and the search techniques around unstructured data are becoming more and more to the fore. Then be able to manage and improve repetitive workflows. That's where SOAR comes in. And finally, have a way of managing the business risk, reaching out to the management structure and letting them know that they are complying with what they are responsible for. And that's where metrics and the ability to build standard rule-based sets comes into play. All of these tenets led to some general sets of requirements, major categories: data management, monitoring and analytics, workflow automation, and user interaction. And we put together kind of what I consider a reference architecture. It's not perfect, it doesn't fit everybody, but it's a guideline to establishing a set of requirements, and it allows people to visualize the various layers in the SIEM and what they be able to focus on where and what they need to procure. So for data management, that core tenets of next generation SIEM feeds into big data storage architecture, the compute and storage architecture that collects and manages large security data sets for indexing and search, enabling real-time data analytics. You've heard the term data lake. It is real. Monitoring and analytics, advanced capabilities that can pull out the hidden threats from large amounts of data and be able to help with complex scenario detection and behavioral monitoring. Workflow and automation, be able to prioritize actions that allow workflow and, most importantly, productivity improvement. The term alert fatigue doesn't just apply to the security industry. It's there in the airlines, it's there in healthcare. But workflow and automation can really help improve the events and the actions that need to be taken in terms of priority. And finally, providing better user insight, real-time views into patterns, trends, and correlations across large data sets. So let's pull back a little bit and look at the evaluation steps. These steps are not necessarily specific to SIEM procurement, but they're kind of a roadmap to follow. So the first thing, most important, is establish a business case. You do
Hey,
So I think that we just need to pause for a second. Barbara's connection dropped, and she should be back in just a few seconds.
I think I'm back online.
oh, there
Sorry,
you are.
guys, we're having weather out here, and I think I probably dropped because of that.
Yeah,
Anyway, sorry. The evaluation steps in terms of the roadmap is establish a business case, strategize on the requirements, which we'll talk about, technical, operational, and business, develop an evaluation instrument, and then be able to use that to evaluate potential vendors, conduct a proof of concept, and finally select your desired vendor. So the first step, and as I said before I lost my voice, probably one of the most important parts is establishing a business case. You need to treat the evaluation process as part of the discovery and planning phase of the project that will follow. If you start here, it really helps focus both the evaluation process and the eventual product and can ensure continued commitment from all stakeholders. Don't underestimate the fact that a charter can help. It kind of brings the stakeholders together, establishes the guidelines that you want to, towards the goals that you want to achieve, and actually can build consensus around the final result. Then the next thing is to strategize on the technical requirements. Understand how the proposed solution is going to integrate with your enterprise infrastructure. both from a technical standpoint and eventually we'll talk a little bit of support. Make sure that you document or provide documentation on the technical infrastructure at a level that can ensure the vendor understands your environment and that you furthermore have a solid basis on which to evaluate their response. And there's a short checklist of what to address. Acceptable performance expectation and constraints. You don't want to have the SIEM be unavailable because of an internal denial of service that's something that could have been easily corrected. You want to make sure you have enough network bandwidth and you don't have a lot of latency. You want to make sure that you can size it. Number of users and projected growth over the next 2 years, as well as additional capabilities you might be adding to your infrastructure. And then the data sources for logs and alerts, both your infrastructure assets and your security devices. Then, as you build that basis, you can also build the elements that you need to evaluate your product capabilities and features against those technical requirements. That's where those areas of data log management or data management and log management come in. Monitoring and analytics, and most importantly, a user interaction. How you're going to present your alerts, how you're going to help users visualize, and how you want to report out on findings. That's an area you definitely do not want to underestimate, because a lot of really good systems often fail because the user interaction, user interface isn't what was expected. And that brings us to the next part, which is you also need to strategize on operational requirements. How is the solution going to fit into your management processes from an operations standpoint, from a compliance standpoint, from an incident and threat response, from a risk management? And there may be other elements that you want to address besides these, but we kind of looked at these as the big four, if you will. And finally, make sure you target what's important. A lot of times people deploy systems that are workflow or process-based, and they fail to really understand how that automation or how that technology is going to help their workflow. So start with a gap assessment of your current security policies and workflows. Document what you can and see where you can put the technology and the tools that a SIEM offers into those workflows. The last thing you want to do, and this has happened because I've often seen it, is you don't want to necessarily, you can make a bad workflow better, but you will realize at the end that you needed to have redesigned the workflow. Other things on operational requirements also to make sure that you have a strategy around. We had already talked about performance and sizing, scalability and growth, storage demands, elimination of false positives, and then as you become more dependent, especially in a mission critical environment, you want to make sure that you account for failover and redundancy. A lot of times a SIEM is a product that is actually an integration platform, so make sure that you can achieve interoperability and interfaces with the third-party products that are in your environment. You don't want to necessarily throw away your legacy tools. They can be as important as the new technologies. And finally, be able to manage from an enterprise view. Management console configuration, the usability and customization, being able to manage rules, monitor status, and provide logging for audit. And finally, the business requirements. This is where the technologists often bump up against the management. So again, you need to also have a good feeling of what your business requirements and assumptions are. Cost versus terms of coverage. Do you need 24-hour support, or can you get by with just during a normal business day? Support and training, regulatory compliance. Don't cut yourself short on the support and training. That can be critical, especially as new features are rolled out, or as new threats become available, or changes in infrastructure happen. And finally, very important, select the best deployment model based on how you plan to support your SIEM into the future. For example, is there already an existing SIEM infrastructure that your organization wants to maintain? Is your organization willing or able to move data off-prem? And do you have security staff with SIEM expertise? This leads us to kind of looking at various models, if you will, for deployment or organizational, ranging anywhere from completely self-hosted and self-managed, which is kind of the legacy, it is the legacy model and is often considered very expensive, but depending on the organization, may still be a very viable option. To cases where you totally outsource SIEM as a service, and you can balance what your organization is responsible for versus what the MSSP is. One thing I can say, though, is never consider that your organization won't have a role, even if SIEM is completely outsourced. You still need to have an understanding of what that platform is doing, because your organization is still responsible, and you and your organization as the Security Operations Center, for example, are still responsible for maintaining what is needed to keep your enterprise operational. From an evaluation standpoint, the next step is in evaluation is a request for proposals and scoring. There are some variations on request for proposal, whether it's a request for information and so forth. I don't want to get into those details. Basically, what you want to do is you want to provide enough information that you can clearly articulate your goals and objectives for deploying the next generation SIEM in your organization. You need to provide enough organizational background, including information about your infrastructure, that allows your vendor to get a feel for your environment, because their product is going to have to be tailored to what you need. And then you ask for your vendor technical response, and this would be scored on a per vendor basis. So you have the vendor describe its solution and how that solution addresses the specific needs of your organization. Provide your detailed requirements, kind of the traditional, the system shall do stuff. The vendor can complete that evaluation matrix. It can be automatically scored, and it further delineates how it intends to meet each stated requirement. Business details, ask how the vendor is going to support the solution, and above all, ask for references. Make sure that, though, you might have some additional references in your pocket that are not vendor, because very often vendors can slant the references they provide towards their best foot forward, so to speak. And then have the vendor follow your pricing structure to describe its product and service offerings. You often find that vendors price differently. You want to be able to compare apples and apples, not apples and oranges. And this area doesn't necessarily need to be scored. You know, we've all heard the lowest cost wins, but you will want to use it during negotiations. So things to ask for in evaluation. One of the big ones, which of your product characteristics make it next generation SIEM, including specific differentiators, and that's where that reference architecture, maybe those core tenets, can help. What are the known performance limitations, and how do you or the vendor plan to overcome them in this implementation? Ask about sizing, even if the platform is cloud-based. Yes, cloud-based can have elasticity in terms of expansion and contraction and storage, but ask about sizing, because very often there's a cost factor involved. What's the process to integrate a new data source into the infrastructure that is being supported by their SIEM? How long does it normally take? And how does that vendor solution support your use cases? And then include a description of the use cases, like incident response based on a recent attack scenario, or what you've encountered in preparing for a compliance audit, including asking for samples of the critical reports that would support that. This actually feeds into what you would do in terms of proof of concept. And since a SIEM is often an enterprise investment, proof of concept, at least in my opinion, depending on the size of the organization, is something that should be undertaken. Yes, it has a cost, but you can have savings down the road. So that's where those scripts that you ask them to describe how their product supports your environment in, let's say, their RFP narrative, you can use that as a basis for proof of concept scripts that reflect one or more of your scenarios. You're going to have to establish a lab environment that is a representative subset of your infrastructure and accommodate those use scenarios. The thing to remember, though, is that lab environment may eventually become your testing environment for your SIEM when you implement it. Take advantage of vendor training and support during the POC, and then focus on the stuff that you can see, feel, and touch. The reports, the dashboards, the visualization. And then finally, as I said, consider the proof of concept as the basis for your eventual implementation. You might want to use those evaluation scenarios and your evaluation results when you start actual deployment. So into the future, investment in SIEM is not something that stops at the initial deployment. The next generation SIEM allows organizations and you to concentrate on capabilities, not infrastructure. You can look at the data and the events that come over and make things a lot more actionable. You're not necessarily worrying about the pipes and platforms, but use that depending on your organizational model, and use that to your advantage in keeping on top of any needed changes. And with that, I would like to pass it to Sarah, who's going to talk a little bit about finding success with NextGen SIEM.
Yeah, thank you, Barbara. This is Sarah Kingsley. Hey guys, I'm happy to join you today. I'm going to run through LogRhythm's perspective on NextGen SIEM. I'll go over kind of the history of how SIEM has evolved to NextGen SIEM, the problems that a NextGen SIEM should solve for your organization, elements that are important to consider when choosing a NextGen SIEM, and then just a few closing thoughts. So I'll start things off today with the primary conundrum that SIEM and NextGen SIEM were created to solve, and that is catching all sorts of different kinds of threats, as well as controlling the cost of being able to, catch threats that may be known and unknown. The first challenge, this especially pertaining to known and unknown threats, is on the graph you see right here. And it relates to detecting different kinds of threats without overburdening the security team. So that a security team, if they only look at known threats using signature-based approaches, experience false negative risk. And that means that your security team isn't detecting threats that are actively attacking their environment because they're just looking at known threats. So what can happen is, an enterprise doesn't think they're in trouble because there's no alarming going on, or they're not seeing anything troubling, when that actually is going on and they just have no idea. That's not a good scenario. You can see this on the left side of the graph with the green line, or the green-yellow line, it looks like, for false negative risk, because that's what you're running if you're just looking at known threats. Traditionally, to lower false negative risk, an organization takes on a very high false positive load. You can see that on the left side of this graph, meaning they lower the accuracy of their alarms to mitigate the risk of missing an important alert to a threat. Because this method isn't highly accurate, then security teams start to experience alarm fatigue. And that was something that Barbara addressed in the very beginning of the webinar, and talking about how, SIEMs have, over time, received a bad name because they're really noisy and buzzy and that type of thing. So, and that kind of speaks to this challenge. Organizations need to look for those known threats, but they also need to try to detect and respond to unknown threats as well. So I mentioned there are two different conundrums. The second is cost of operations. The whole purpose of SIEM technology is to increase the security team's ability to detect and respond to threats and lower their mean time to detect and mean time to respond. The second challenge is the cost of operations for the security team to detect and respond to known and unknown threats and lower their risk profile without the cost of operations exceeding what the organization can afford. Ultimately, if it's too expensive to optimize the false positive load and false negative risk, then companies will just bear the risk, and they may not be very security conscious themselves. So the way to kind of mitigate that, or essentially the fundamental goal of NextGen SIEM, is to change that slope from where you saw it, where it was kind of in the middle, to now it's on the bottom, where cost of operations is controlled for, or is something that the organization can afford. Through technology, this can help companies reduce that risk of experiencing a damaging cyber incident through accelerating and making sure they can detect and respond to threats quickly, and having a more manageable, affordable cost of operations. And that's the crux of NextGen SIEM. Should help you control for cost of operations, because it's going to introduce efficiencies, as well as you should be getting a high ROI from that solution. So to kind of, Barbara talked about this earlier, SIEM is really, it's evolved over time, This timeline that I'm showing you right now shows how SIEM technology has evolved from something that's more perimeter-centric to detection and response centric, to then evolve to what many vendors are calling NextGen SIEM today. This timeline is approximate, but the technology inventions across the timeline help show what security teams have needed over time. So you can see compliance in them, be it file integrity monitoring or more toward the left side. And then in more recent years, we've seen stronger analytics solutions like UEBA or an ML-based analytics. And then most recently, SOAR, or Security Orchestration, Automation, and Response Platform for operations. It's important to keep in mind NextGen SIEM is an evolution of these technologies over time. It's not necessarily something that's cut and dry, or anything like that. It's the vendors that have really kept up with technology and kept up with their customers to make sure that they were addressing the challenges that they had. So another way to look at this is this next slide. This is another visualization of kind of the evolution of NextGen SIEM. I've got three different, vendors on here. Vendor A is more of a legacy SIEM. Vendor B is more of a NextGen SIEM, and vendor C is a new analytics entrant. So the legacy SIEM at the top hasn't evolved as quickly to security needs. This offering has a strong foundation in basic SIEM. That's log management, those pieces that Barbara talked about earlier. But it was slow to market with security analytics, UEBA, and more recently SOAR. Vendor B offers a mature mixture of all those four different characteristics of NextGen SIEM. And I'll tell you too, just for reference, the four categories I'm using for this slide are how Forrester looks at security analytics in their ways. So I kind of wanted to use a couple different perspectives. This is not necessarily Sarah Kingsley's or LogRhythm's way of looking at SIEM, but this is just a different perspective to look at it. So like I said, vendor B offers that mature mixture of all those characteristics. They built it over time, and they kept up with technologies that security teams needed to tackle those threats, even if those technologies aren't necessarily best in breed if you were to go out and buy a point solution. So that's the NextGen SIEM that I've got illustrated here. And then we've got vendor C, which is a visual example of a new analytics entrant to the market. This vendor started out maybe bringing a UEBA solution to market. Over time, they realized their analytics solution needed to be paired more with SIEM technology, be it log management more in particular, maybe threat intelligence and some of those other pieces that SANS addresses in their NextGen SIEM architecture requirements. You can see this vendor is trying to build the foundational elements of log management and SOAR to their offering to attract, to be a more attractive solution for security teams. So they'll eventually be able to build up to, in this diagram, number 3 is a more mature solution. So having all the elements beyond 3, so 3 to 5, is something that's a more mature solution, more sophisticated. So you can see they're getting there. They're not there yet, but they're getting there. So I mentioned SANS architecture requirements. And in this part of the presentation, I'm going to run through each layer of the architecture requirements for NextGen SIEM and offer some tips on what to consider and what benefits you should be receiving in each layer. So the first layer I'll go through is the data management requirements layer. This layer, it contains the data collection, management, and enrichment for NextGen SIEM. And the benefits a prospect should receive from this layer is that it enables search and machine-based analytics that are less resource-intensive and delivers more accurate threat detection while reducing risk of false negatives through correlation. Things to consider when you're reviewing a NextGen SIEM solution in the data management layer include what sort of data sources you want to bring in to the SIEM and whether those sources are supported by the vendor. So for example, Barbara mentioned when she was going over this layer, cloud. So if you're bringing in cloud sources, is there an additional cost? Make sure they can take them in, but then also check for additional costs as well. Additionally, due to compliance or security standards, how long do you need to archive or keep logs? Whether that data collection and management layer was designed for security use cases is also important. For example, if the data management layer is designed for security, then it would probably try to include things like geolocation, IP contacts, and other data points that will help inform the security analyst as they get alarms or as they see threats coming into their enterprise. The next layer I'll run through is monitoring and analytics. This layer is the powerhouse for taking in the data management layer that we just discussed and identifying threats that are known and unknown and help the organization demonstrate compliance. Like I explained in the beginning of the webinar, one of the most important benefits of an NextGen SIEM is that they give a customer, they help the customer optimize for threat detection for known and unknown threats. To accomplish this goal, security teams need to look at NextGen SIEMs that include both scenario and behavioral analytics approaches, and make sure that solution can take in any threat intelligence services as well that they might use for context. So think about those known and unknown threats, trying to bring in security or scenario and behavioral analytics. Okay. The next layer is workflow audit, is the workflow automation layer. And this piece is the operational piece of a NextGen SIEM. And this usually includes pieces of what the market calls SOAR, or security, orchestration, automation, and response, that has just been introduced in the past couple of years, or more maturely in the past couple of years, I should say. The purpose of this layer is to increase efficiency, consistency, and predictability of incident response processes, and provide metrics to help the SOC measure and decrease their mean time to detect and mean time to respond. Things to consider when looking at NextGen SIEM solutions, particularly at this layer, are the increased benefits of whether the SOAR solution is native to this platform, be it the NextGen SIEM platform, or whether it's something that's integrated in. Native SOAR can really increase efficiency further with a NextGen SIEM, especially when they access the same UI, used to review and work with incident response tasks or steps during an investigation. I'll also point out playbook functionality, if the NextGen SIEM has that, helps analysts standardize that workflow when they're able to utilize a flexible automation framework. Then with that flexible automation framework, they can automatically align tasks to an observed activity to trigger an automated or semi-automated response. And that really, again, helps drive efficiency for the SOC. Final layer in SAN's NextGen SIEM requirements kind of architecture is my favorite. This last layer is known as the user interaction layer. This piece is vitally important because it increases efficiency and effectiveness of analysts' time to qualify and time to investigate through prioritization and different visuals. A well thought out and connected user interaction layer is important because without it, you would only have those four components of a NextGen SIEM, but it wouldn't necessarily be seamless or have intuitive dashboards that take you through every single layer, depending on where you are in that investigation. Dashboards help analysts prioritize. And if you're not able to do that seamlessly, then your security team isn't able to realize those operational efficiencies that help control costs, as well as help just overall efficiency and improvement of mean time to detect, mean time to respond. This layer is all about functionality. Things to consider when reviewing this layer include the ability for the solution to bring in external context to help analysts make decisions without pivoting out of the main UI, the ability to run structured and unstructured search, and access to data without knowing the underlying data architecture of the NextGen SIEM. And all those pieces that I have in things to consider are just to help you increase efficiency. It might be that you're looking at one that maybe doesn't have one of those things that I'm asking you to think about, but that just then will impact efficiency overall of the NextGen SIEM solution. So now I'm going to run through just a couple different ways that you can realize NextGen SIEM. I've got three on the slide right here. So we've got a do-it-yourself model, we've got a purpose-built platform model, and we've got a bolted-together model. So the do-it-yourself, this looks like your security team, or maybe you're working a co-managed with an MSP, or maybe it's fully managed by the MSP. maybe you're working with Deloitte, for example, and it's fully managed by them. It might be that you're asking Deloitte, or you're asking your security team, IT and security team, to build a NextGen SIEM themselves. And a lot of teams really like this because, a lot of people that are attracted to security positions or have worked in IT love building things. So this SIEM solution, our way to realize NextGen SIEM, is all about having the ability to build the pieces yourself, which is really exciting and can be very customizable. Some of the cons of that approach, though, are that it's exorbitantly expensive. Because your staff on site or maybe through an MSP are developing all of that yourself. And that's really resource intensive, takes a long time, and needs to be updated on a regular basis as the security market or the security landscape changes, really. So the second way to realize NextGen SIEM is the purpose-built platform. So you'll notice in these pictures, for do-it-yourself, I've got elements of how you build a house. The middle one is a built house, and that's the idea. Is a purpose-built platform is from a security vendor that has done all that work for you. So they've taken the materials, maybe it was some open source different tools, maybe it was in-house elements they built or solutions they built themselves, and they put together a NextGen SIEM platform that has all native characteristics. So it was built to flow and to work as one tool. That's the purpose-built platform. We also have the bolted together. And so you can see from my picture, we've got two different style buildings that are essentially become one. This is just a visual element to what bolted together to reach NextGen SIEM means. This could be, for example, a vendor that through time developed a log management solution. It did well, tried to follow security trends to meet what security teams needed. But over time, maybe it was easier for them to acquire different companies. And so they're building different integration paths to try to help customers realize NextGen SIEM. The potential problems with that, though, are that then you're working with a solution that workflow wasn't necessarily the primary aspect that they designed around. So sometimes with those solutions, the analyst workflow efficiency isn't as efficient as it could be. And that can have an impact, again, on controlling for the cost of operations, as well as making sure you're trying to detect known and unknown threats. So those are the different ways you can realize NextGen SIEM. Also have this short slide on, hey, you could do this in-house or you could outsource it. I just wrote some pros and cons here. I'm going to run through the slide really quickly just for time. Some of the pros of working co-managed or fully managed with an MSSP include you can control the cost of operations. That's one of the challenges that we talked about in the beginning because it's based on the contract, so you know how much you're going to spend. It also has some flexibility where you can choose your service level, and whereas the team that will be co-managing or managing your stock at that point looks at a lot of different organization stocks. So they're able to understand the trends maybe quicker than you would in-house. Some of the cons or risks involved with that, co-managing or outsourcing your SOC are that compliance liability still rests with your organization, regardless of the fact that security is being handled outside your organization. Typically, an outside organization isn't going to understand your business or context and organization as well as your internal staff would. That's, one of the advantages of having more in-house staff for security. Also, it's possible there could be a lack of dedicated staff to your deployment if it's outsourced or co-managed. So, this could be a great option to control costs, but the cons are just there's different risks that you're allowing outside source to kind of help you manage. So I'm going to wrap things up with talking about the benefits of NextGen SIEM again, and then just leaving you with some final thoughts. So in summary, the benefits of a NextGen SIEM are efficient threat detection. That's through scenario and behavioral analytics with machine learning. Also, streamlined workflow. to investigate and remediate quickly. So that helps control the cost, is the reason why that streamlined workflow is really important. And having a native source solution that's been built in and was architected to work with the rest of the pieces of the NextGen SIEM is really going to give you an advantage in time efficiency. The NextGen SIEM should also improve SOC metrics or give you SOC performance metrics. As we all know, if you can't measure it, you can't improve it. And we all want to improve our security posture of our organizations. So it's really important that NextGen SIEM is giving you metrics that you can build baselines on, you can understand workflow bottlenecks, and then you can improve those pieces. Finally, you should be getting a high ROI out of that investment. One platform that contains all the capabilities of NextGen SIEM, all your costs is kind of bundled in one, but make sure that you're getting what you paid for, if you will, when you invest in a NextGen SIEM. So my final slide, this is a quote actually from Gartner's new paper. It came out in October of this year, Technology Insights for the Modern SIEM. And I think this is a really good closing comment. So the quote is, the evolution of SIEM analytics continues to be shaped by the requirements for high fidelity detection rates, or fewer false positives and more true positives, and lowering operation and tuning costs. So at the end of the day, think about when you're assessing and trying to decide and looking at some technologies, at the end of the day, is it something that's helping you get at and understand known and unknown threats? And then is it controlling for cost as well through efficiency gains, as well as helping your team benchmark and improve? So I hope this has been helpful. I look forward to your questions, as I believe we're moving into question and answer portion.
Yep, that's right. We'll go ahead and start taking a couple of questions. There is one, and you mentioned metrics briefly at the end there. Can you just go ahead and elaborate on what some of the metrics are that you see for the NextGen SIEMs?
Yeah, of course. So some of the metrics, for example, that are most common that I see are mean time to detect and mean time to respond. That have to do with, how long did it take for your SIEM solution to detect a threat, and then how long did it take for analysts to, investigate that threat or remediate that threat for that response part. Other metrics that I've seen include a time to qualify and a time to investigate, which are kind of micro elements of mean time to respond, mean time to detect. Those are some of the overall metrics. They're usually around the security operations workflow on being able to baseline and then improve it over time and collecting metrics along the way.
Okay, and Barbara, was there anything you wanted to add to that one, just in terms of that question?
Not off the top of my head, though. I think that looking at some of the companion guides from, I forget the exact precise name, but some of the metrics that the critical controls put in there also might be things that would be worthwhile. So besides the timing, in terms of how many devices are, responding in terms of collecting logs, and also being able to present those metrics on the workflow to identify if there's any bottlenecks in the process.
I see. So
Go ahead, Chris.
I was just going to say, so part of the idea of what you're saying is that the one of the aspects of this SIEM that you're looking for is that if you have workflow in there and you have metrics in there, then one of the things that it does is just sort of by virtue of having identified what you expect to have happen, then it can identify where there are problems that it's encountering and people aren't performing to expectations. Those expectations might be off base to begin with, but the idea is that we can look at it there because it's all sort of in the same console. Yeah, and precisely. And actually, I'm drawing that a little bit also from other industries I've touched, like document management and the healthcare interoperability and some of the workflows that have developed around the fact that data is becoming more interoperable and able to be collected in more of a central location outside of organizations. So, yes. Okay, great. Another one is there any sense of how long before you start to see some payback from the implementation of a NextGen SIEM? And related, how long does it take really to get to even just sort of operational performance? Like what's an expectation? If you decide to buy this, you follow the methodology, you go ahead and implement this thing. At what point would you expect to be doing these sort of more advanced capabilities? Is that 3 months or 6 months or 12 months? And then the related part to that is, if you invest all this time in the project to develop that, is there any sense of how long before you get some value returned from that investment?
Sure. I'll take that question, Chris. So I'll tell you from my experience working with LogRhythm prospects and customers, a lot of the timing is really dependent on the deployment. For example, if it is a very large deployment for a very large company, let's say that's in Fortune 100, 500, something like that, the deployment may be really complicated. And so it may take time to deploy and as well as to build in or make sure those use cases are being built. It's also dependent upon staffing, of course. So staffing at that company, whether it's co-managed, whether it's managed all in-house, and then how involved the security team is with some of the deployment aspects. But companies are of different size. So for example, I've spoken to LogRhythm customers that within the first 6 months, we're starting to see benefits based on their purchase of our NextGen SIEM, for example. It just is really dependent upon a lot of different factors. So it's really hard to give a timeline that's going to be exact for every single size customer. But I hope that's helpful.
And I'd actually like to add to that a little bit, Chris. I think that Sarah brings up a good point. It's going to vary because this is very much kind of a integration platform, if you will, across the various people-based and technology-based workflows in a company. It's going to have to be the expectations are going to be in accordance with how it integrates into the whole environment. And so that's one of the points. If you can script a proof of concept for that smaller subset, you can kind of get a feeling for what your initial success would be. And then the other thing is, don't try to bite off the whole elephant. Start with a fairly small, well-defined mini project, if you will, that you can achieve success. Get the buy-in to have the right people there to help you support it, and drive towards the business objectives for that smaller pilot. I won't call it a pilot project because it's actually a production, but you're limiting your production so you get that initial success, and then you can build from there.
Yeah, I'll just echo exactly what Barbara just said. Having that project plan, making sure you're stepped in the process of deploying a NextGen SIEM is super important. That way you kind of know when you've reached, that phase is complete, as well as you can see the solution unfold over time that's customized to your environment, which is very important.
Okay, and actually, just as a follow-on to that, one that I'm thinking of is, can you give some thoughts on what might be good areas to start with? What are some things that you've seen where customers have sort of started off and been successful so that they can get maturity more quickly? What have they chosen? Are they picking a subset of servers? Is it one department? How are people making that selection, and what has been successful for people? And probably have to give a little context of why it was successful for them, if you can share that.
Yeah, so I'm thinking of a couple examples related to what you asked, Chris. A lot of the very successful deployments that reach a high ROI quickly, a lot of times they are limiting their data sources. So they're really concentrated on what are the data sources that are most impactful or would be the most interesting for an attacker to come in and try to take or try to gain access to. So they're making sure financials are on there, and they're making sure other parts of their business that have the highest risk or the most importance for compliance and demonstrating compliance, to make sure those are onboarded and taken care of initially. They're not intaking every single data source they have in their enterprise to start out with. That's more of that paced approach. And every business is individual. So depending on the industry or the business context that they have within their business, the use cases can vary. Financial fraud is something a lot of financial companies care about. So one of those companies, for example, a customer may onboard a lot more of those use cases, or really try to tackle those use cases first, because it usually is involved in whatever where the business risk is the highest, is the area they want to start in. And I think in, really coming up with a comprehensive plan on what they're buying that NextGen SIEM for, what use cases they want to tackle, and what logs are connected or data sources are connected to that, is a good way to kind of start out thinking about what that should look like for your individual organization or business.
And to just add a little bit to that, I think it's not just focusing on data sources and risk, but also if you have a workflow component, where can you get the most benefit for the cost? Are there people that is your team suffering from alert fatigue? And are there structured, what are the structured workflows that can feed into that, such as some of the things around incident response? That's where I've seen a lot of the emphasis being placed initially.
Okay, so
yeah, I agree.
I was just going to recap that. So the one component is to select an appropriate use case, and then look for the specific data sources around that one priority use case, only ingest those so that there isn't a lot of noise. And then related, what Barbara went on to say was to look at where your current pain points are, and then look for something within the NextGen SIEM capability in order to attempt to relieve those pain points. So two sort of different strategies that people can potentially employ in order to select where to start. I think time for one last question, which is, have you seen, is there a real value to having kind of that single integrated screen to help with the playbooks and the behavioral analytics and the other components that are promised in this NextGen SIEM? And if so, can you kind of elaborate on some of the value for analysts that you've observed for that?
Yeah, sure. I'll take that, Chris. I talked about in my presentation multiple times native SOAR capabilities, and that's the idea that whether it's integrated or whether it was built by the company, that SOAR capability is accessed through the same UI that maybe alarms, has dashboards for alarms or other pieces like that. And really what that kind of gets at, or why that's important, is kind of that dream of the single pane of glass for security within a SOC. Analysts are able to save a lot of time if they don't have to pivot in and out. They're not changing their browser tabs. They're not, logging in and out of different other solutions to try to investigate something. Because the one way I'll point out this value is, I know if, our listeners out there, if their day is anything like my day, then at different points in time, somebody's going to come to my desk and ask me a question. I'm going to want to answer their question. I may completely forget where I am in that workflow. And if I'm having to pivot in and out of different tools because there's not an integrated incident response workflow, I might forget where I am. And that's not great from a security standpoint, or no matter what your job is. So I just give that as an example. It's just, when you're within one interface, it's a lot easier to start and stop, as well as you and other security analysts in that position are able to gain a lot of time efficiency, just because it's all contained in one.
So I agree with what Sarah says. The one thing, though, that I think is an interesting element that probably should be considered is that, and I think you expressed it, Chris, with the signal to noise, you need to make sure that if you bring everything into that single pane of glass, that there's a unifying you've got unification at the data level, let's put it that way, using big words, to make sure that the information that's being collected from the various data sources is based on apples and apples, not apples and oranges. So there's a harmonization that needs to occur, I think, at a data level within a SIEM. And that is probably one of the things that needs to be looked at in developing and meeting the use cases that you start building from.
Okay, well, great. Yeah, I think that is beneficial. So we don't have any additional questions. So I want to thank both of you for sharing this information. Thanks for Carol for taking care of this. Thanks, Barbara. Thank you, Sarah. And there will be a recording of this available if you want to go back to it later. And thank you all for attending.
All right, well, thank you so much, Barb, Chris, and Sarah, for your great presentation, and to LogRhythm for sponsoring this webcast, which helps bring this content to the SANS community. To our audience, we greatly appreciate you listening in. For a schedule of all upcoming and archived SANS webcasts, including this one, please visit sans.org/webcast. Until next time, take care, and we hope to have you back again for the next SANS webcast.